Chapter 29, Joint Congressional Committee on the Investigation of the Pearl Harbor Attack, November 15, 1945 to May 31, 1946, Part 3. The Joint Congressional Committee still had many potential witnesses in its list whose testimony was expected to prove important. Among these were Admiral R.E. Ingersoll, Assistant Chief of Naval Operations, as well as several men who had been closely concerned with magic, Captain L.F. Safford, who had been in charge of the Security Section of Naval Communications, Captain A.D. Kramer, Navy Translator and Courier, and Colonel Rufus S. Bratton, Army Courier. The JCC members did not find it easy to learn how much was known in Washington before the attack about the imminence of war, when it was known, and how much information was relayed to the Pearl Harbor commanders. Top Washington officials confer daily on impending crisis. When testifying before the Hart and Navy Court inquiries, Assistant Chief of Naval Operations Ingersoll had admitted having seen the winds execute before December 7, 1941. However, in his JCC testimony, he belittled its importance as a war warning. The wording in that winds message did not say that we are going to be in a state of war or that hostilities now exist. It referred to a rupture of diplomatic negotiations or that the situation between the countries was becoming critical. If you rupture diplomatic negotiations, you do not necessarily have to burn your codes. The diplomats go home and they can pack up their codes and take them home. Ingersoll considered the destruction of the code dispatches much more important. They not only told their diplomats in Washington and London to burn their codes, but they told their consuls in Manila, in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Batavia to burn their codes. And that did not mean a rupture of diplomatic negotiations, it meant war, and that information was sent out to the fleets as soon as we got it. When we received the original message, which set up the winds code that became important then, because that would be the first indication that we would get of when the Japanese thought they would rupture negotiations or be at war if a broader interpretation were placed on it. But once we had learned that they were destroying their codes, then the winds message lost its importance. The fact that the consulates were included cinched, in my opinion, that it was war and not a rupture of diplomatic negotiations or diplomatic relations. Ingersoll did not recall having seen any of the several ships in harbor intercepts, not even the one that divided Pearl Harbor into 5 areas, to report each shifting and visit of ships from one area to another. If he had, he would have wanted to know why they were interested in the actual location of a ship within a harbor, as distinguished from whether or not the ship just happened to be in port. If he had seen that dispatch, his suspicion would have been aroused. He thought Admiral Kimmel should have been informed. Ingersoll had known of the November 29 deadline set by the Japanese, after which things were automatically going to happen. It was well known that Japanese troops could reach several potential targets in Southeast Asia in a very short time: China, Indochina, Formosa. The situation was reviewed almost daily, he said, at conferences in the office of Navy Secretary Knox. Yet day after day went by after the November 29 deadline without a Japanese strike. Ingersoll states, "There was a conference in Mr. Knox's office every morning in which the Director of Naval Intelligence presented the whole situation, and the possibilities were discussed. By the Director of War Plans, Admiral Turner, the situation was reviewed every morning. Gerhardt, were there in those meetings after the 29th discussions of why that had occurred, after we had read the Jap intercept, that after the 29th things were going to happen automatically? Did anybody in those meetings raise the question that possibly the Japanese were sailing to a distant point of attack?" Ingersoll replies, "No, none that I recall. The question of an attack on Pearl Harbor, of course, was always considered as a possibility. The places in the Far East were the only places of which we had definite information towards which the Japanese were moving. I did not think that the Japanese would risk an air attack on Pearl Harbor. Our estimate was that the Japanese would not do that they were fully occupied with what they were doing at that time, and that the risks were too great. In view of our knowledge of Japanese military movements and our close political ties with the British and Dutch, Representative Gerhardt and Senator Ferguson tried to determine what the United States would have done had the Japanese struck British and or Dutch positions and not U.S. territory." Ferguson states, "Did you know what our policy was prior to Pearl Harbor? If there was an attack on the Malay Peninsula, what the position would be of the United States of America as far as the Navy or the Army were concerned?" Ingersoll replies, "As far as the Navy and Army were concerned, what we would do was contained in our war plans. I do not think there was anybody in the Navy Department who knew what would happen if Japan went into the Malay Peninsula or into Siam or Thailand. The position of the Navy would have been the position taken by the United States government, and what the President would have recommended to the Congress about declaring war. The Navy's position would have been exactly the position of the United States." Ingersoll did not believe the United States would go to war in the Pacific without any recommendation to the Congress, as they had in the Atlantic. That was not a legal war. The Germans were still here in Washington, and they had not declared war on us for all that we had been doing to them in the Atlantic. The next day, Ingersoll half apologized for his remark. He had almost humorously called the war in the Atlantic as illegal. It was more in the nature of irregular. In the Atlantic, we were doing some things which only a belligerent does. There had been no declaration of war. We had done a great many things that under international law, as it was understood before the last war, were unneutral. It was apparently to her, Germany's advantage, to have us as a non-belligerent rather than as a full belligerent. President orders defensive information patrol in South China Sea. The U.S. government was receiving information on Japanese ship movements in the Southwest Pacific and China Sea from our daily overflights, as well as from reports from the British. Yet, at about 7 p.m. on December 1, the President directed Admiral Thomas Hart, Commander-in-Chief of the Asiatic Fleet in Manila, to charter 3 small vessels to form a defensive information patrol. The 3 small ships were to be manned by a U.S. naval officer and equipped with 1 small gun and a machine gun, the minimum requirements to establish identity as U.S. men of war. They were to be stationed in the paths of known Japanese ship movements, number 1 between Hainan Island, China, and Hue on the east coast of Indochina, now Vietnam. Number 2, east of the Indochina coast between Cam Ranh Bay and Cape St. Jacques, and number 3 off Point de Camal on the southern tip of Indochina. All 3 vessels were to observe and report by radio Japanese movements in West China Sea and Gulf of Siam. Ferguson wanted to know why Stark had ordered 3 small vessels to watch for Japanese movements on British possessions. Ingersoll replied simply the dispatch had said, "President directs." That was our reason for doing it. Admiral Stark was told by the President to do it. Admiral Hart was already conducting reconnaissance off that coast by planes from Manila. I am sure Admiral Stark would not have done this unless he had been told. We did not initiate this movement, sir, and we were getting sufficient information from Admiral Hart by the searches which his planes were making. Footnote number 11 reads, in the same place, Part 9, pages 4252 through 53. Of these 3 small vessels, only 1 got to sea before the Japanese attack. The Isabel left Manila on December 3 with orders to proceed to Cam Ranh Bay on the Indochina coast, ostensibly to search for a lost Navy PBY plane. On the 5th, about 22 miles from the Indochina coast, she was sighted by a Japanese Navy pilot and ordered to return to Manila, where she arrived on December 8. Kent Tolley, cruise of the Lani Kai, Annapolis, Maryland, Naval Institute, 1973, pages 269 and 70. The second ship, the Lani Kai, skippered by then-Lieutenant Kent Tolley, was preparing to leave Manila when the attack came. She patrolled the coast of the Philippines for a couple of weeks, finally departing Manila on December 26, and after some adventures reached Australia. In the same work, page 120. The third small ship selected, the Molly Moore, was never commissioned. When the attack came, her mission became superfluous. In the same work, page 272. Author's note. Apparently, Hart looked on the mission of these 3 small vessels as mission impossible. When ordering the Lani Kai to the coast of Indochina, in the same work, page 19, Hart said he had felt he was sending its skipper on what looked like a one-way mission. Tolley thought that FDR may have been offering these small ships and the men aboard to bait an incident as casus belli, in the same work, page 279. Hart wanted to know why the President had sent the message ordering these vessels to sea. He felt the order might have been a reflection on his overflight reports. PLG 1962, interview of Hart. Had the President personally given him, Stark, the order to send the dispatch concerning these vessels? Stark said he had discussed with the President where this Japanese expedition going south was likely to hit. His, the President's, thought was the Kra Peninsula. The Philippines was a possibility, and the East Indies, and just where it would go we did not know, and these 3 small vessels were to assist in that determination. You will see where the President put them. They were well placed to get information, either positive or negative. And it was for that reason, and for the reasons as stated in the dispatch, to get information, that he directed that be done. He says, to form a defensive information patrol, to accomplish a purpose which is to observe and report by radio Japanese movements in the West China Sea and Gulf of Siam. And then he himself designated where those vessels were to be placed, and they were well placed for the purposes for which he wanted them. I simply think that he thought that was additional precautions. He was intensely interested in every move at that time, as we all were. Of course, one cannot know what FDR had in mind in issuing this directive. It may have been out of concern for his commitments to the British and Dutch. He may have been trying to do what Stimson had suggested at FDR's War Cabinet meeting November 25, to maneuver them, the Japanese, into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. Few would be killed or wounded by a shot fired on such a minimally equipped U.S. man of war. Yet it might be incident enough to call for U.S. military intervention against the Japanese. Maintaining the secrecy of the Japanese intercepts and magic. It was apparent throughout the several investigations that special effort had been made to keep information about the purple machines and the magic intercepts secret. Quite understandably, extreme caution was necessary before the war to prevent any security leak. And during the war, when the intercepts were still yielding intelligence valuable in the struggle against the Japanese, it was necessary to continue to maintain tight security. However, the determination to maintain silence persisted even after August 1945, when Japan surrendered, and even after President Truman, who had taken office on the death of FDR, had revealed the existence of magic by releasing to the public the secret 1944 reports of the Navy Court of Inquiry and the Army Pearl Harbor Board. When finally, in December 1945, the restrictions against revealing magic were further relaxed to permit witnesses before the JCC to testify and give information regarding cryptanalytic activities, which had to do with the investigation of the Pearl Harbor incident, many witnesses revised their stories. Safford, Bratton, and Kramer had been intimately involved in handling the Japanese intercepts, and each had been questioned at length during previous investigations while the war continued. Each had then faced the same dilemma: how to respond to pressures placed on them by wartime patriotism and loyalty to their superior officers, and how to testify under oath to the truth as they saw it, without revealing military secrets. Then, when questioned during the JCC hearings after the war and after restrictions had been relaxed, they had to decide whether to modify or to defend their previous testimony. As we shall see, each responded differently. Captain L. F. Safford, Naval Communications Security, discovers Kimmel had not been sent magic. In 1941, Safford had been in charge of the security section of Naval Communications. He testified that after the attack, he, like millions of other Americans, blamed Kimmel for the terrible losses at Pearl Harbor. He assumed Kimmel had been sent information derived from magic. Safford was bitter. He could not understand why Kimmel had not been ready for the attack. Safford said he thought that if Kimmel had received the Winds Execute, which Safford had seen on December 4, Kimmel surely would have recognized its significance and would have been completely ready for the attack on Pearl Harbor, in fact with his fleet at sea, and Pearl Harbor just an empty nest. After Safford read the Roberts Commission report, he expected to be called as a witness for the prosecution against Kimmel, so he began to review the pre-attack record. To his dismay, Safford discovered that important information derived from the magic intercepts decoded before the attack had not gone to Kimmel. By mid-January 1944, Safford realized that the Navy Department had not sent out the war warning prepared by Captain McCollum, which Safford had read in Admiral Noyes' office on the afternoon of December 4, 1941. His sense of justice was aroused. Kimmel had been unfairly accused. Safford then shifted from siding with the prosecution to siding with the defense. At that point, Safford set the wheels in motion that led in time to revealing purple and magic information. On February 21, 1944, Safford called on retired Kimmel in New York. From notes and memory, Safford related to Kimmel information that had been available before the attack in Washington, information which would have been invaluable to the Pearl Harbor commanders. Safford's revelation were Kimmel's first intimation that, in spite of his request to be kept fully informed, Washington had not sent him pre-attack U.S.-Japanese information relevant to his situation as U.S. Fleet Commander-in-Chief. When Safford returned to Washington and attempted to document his assertions to Kimmel, however, he found to his amazement that pre-attack magic intercepts, which were supposed to have been permanently retained in locked Navy files, were missing. When Safford came before the JCC, February 1 through 5, 1946, he had already appeared, while the war was still going on, before the Hart Inquiry, the APHB, the NCI, and the Hewitt Inquiry. Both the APHB and NCI had been authorized by Congress to conduct thorough investigations and to handle super-secret materials. Safford had told them the truth about magic and purple as best he could, and he continued to stick to his story when appearing at the JCC. Safford described to the Congressional Committee in considerable detail the procedure which had been followed to prevent knowledge of magic and especially the Winds Code Execute from becoming known. The personal or immediate custodian was Lieutenant Commander Harrison, U.S. Naval Reserve. Safford explained that the only people who had access to then Commander, now Captain Kramer's safe were those on duty under Captain Kramer. Everything was normally clear through Commander Harrison. There were no more than 10 people at the most: translators and the yeoman on duty in Kramer's section, the head of the section, Safford, or the officer who relieved Safford, or the Director of Naval Intelligence might possibly have been called for files at any time. Any higher authority would have been given the files without question if he had requested them. A copy of the Winds Execute message should have been in the files of Safford's division in the locked safe of Captain Kramer. Safford states, "To the best of my knowledge, the combination to the safe was held by Kramer and Harrison alone. There was a copy of the combination in a sealed envelope in my safe. There was another copy of the combination in a sealed envelope in the safe of the aide to the Chief of Naval Operations. That was required for all safes in naval operations, so in case of casualty to the man who regularly opened the safe could be opened when we had to. I know of no occasion when we ever had to open those sealed envelopes and enter the safe. I might add, whenever an officer was relieved, we changed the combination on a safe and substituted the new cards, and that was the only time we ever had to get into those envelopes." Finally, in 1944, Safford succeeded in locating a single set of most of the missing intercepts, had copies made, and placed in the files where they belonged. However, one message, Japan's Winds Execute, which Safford considered especially crucial, was not found. Safford claimed Winds Execute was received before December 7. If so, was that significant? Washington officials were well aware of the impending crisis, Safford said. On December 3, the U.S. military attaché in the American embassy in Tokyo had been ordered to destroy his ciphers and codes. On December 4, Greenwich time, December 3, Washington time, the U.S. naval attaché in Tokyo was ordered to do the same. Also, on December 4, the U.S. consular agents in the Far East had been told to destroy their codes. When Safford knew he would be called to testify before the Congressional Committee, he prepared a written statement. It was primarily about the Winds code setup. On November 26 and 28, Washington had learned from Tokyo Circulars 2353 and 2354 that Japan planned to broadcast in the course of a routine news program a false weather message with a hidden meaning. If the Japanese embassies and consulates worldwide had to destroy their codes and code machines and could no longer decipher encoded messages, this so-called Winds code setup would enable Tokyo to communicate secretly with her overseas officials and to advise them when events leading to war would automatically begin to happen. Safford's prepared statement started, "There was a Winds message. It meant war, and we knew it meant war." By we, Safford meant those who had been working on magic and with whom he had been in close contact, such as Kramer, McCollum, Wilkinson, and Noyes. Safford considered that message clear evidence of the imminence of war. Thus, he was puzzled when Washington officials did not send out any truly urgent warnings. In Safford's words, the Winds Execute was the unheeded warning of war. As soon as the Japanese Winds code setup messages were intercepted, Admiral Wilkinson, Director of Naval Intelligence, directed Safford, through Admiral Noyes, Director of Naval Communications, to alert all intercept stations capable of monitoring Japanese news broadcasts to listen for such a false weather announcement. Safford described for the committee the preparations he had made for intercepting this message. Safford not only considered the Winds code setup extremely important, but he believed that the eagerness of senior U.S. officers to have Japanese news programs followed closely on the chance of intercepting such a false weather broadcast was evidence that they shared his view that it concerned something much more important than merely a break in diplomatic negotiations. That receipt of a Winds Execute would even portend the actual outbreak of war. U.S. government officials realized that if the Japanese implemented their Winds code and actually sent such a false weather message, it would have had still further significance as a definite portent of conflict. Safford considered the implementation of the Winds code the most important message we had up to the time of the pilot message on December 6, announcing that the Japanese reply to our note of November 26 was on its way. The significance of the Winds Execute, if received, was reinforced by intelligence available from other sources. Number 1, the Japanese cable designating November 29 the deadline for terminating U.S.-Japanese negotiations, after which things are automatically going to happen. Number 2, the instructions to overseas Japanese nationals to destroy their codes. The Winds Execute gained further significance because of its indication that Japan wanted to reach its nationals all over the world after their codes were destroyed, because of the positive evidence it would give that Japan definitely intended to act soon, and that war was about to start against the country or countries indicated. England, Russia, United States. According to Safford, any country or countries named in a winds execute would actually be involved in the war from the very beginning, and not just as a spectator. Thus, the interception of a winds execute would provide us with an announcement of the intentions and decision of the Japanese government. In Safford's words, it would be a short-range forecast of war. Safford testified that a winds execute was actually intercepted in Morse code, and that Navy courier Kramer had delivered it to him in his office on the morning of December 4, 1941, typed on yellow teletype paper. It had indicated war with England and war with the United States. Kramer had underscored the 3 code words in the message and had written below in pencil or colored crayon a rough translation. War with England, including NEI, etc. War with the U.S., peace with Russia. This is it, Kramer said as he handed the paper to Safford. This meant that Japan would soon be at war not only with Great Britain, but also with the United States. This was the broadcast we had strained every nerve to intercept, Safford said. This was the feather in our cap. This was the tip-off which would prevent the U.S. Pacific Fleet being surprised at Pearl Harbor, the way the Russians had been surprised at Port Arthur. This was what the Navy Communications Intelligence had been preparing for since its establishment in 1924, war with Japan. Safford had immediately sent the winds execute by special messenger to Noyes Naval Communications. If the messenger could not find Noyes in a reasonable time, he was to let Safford know. In a few minutes, Safford received word that the message had been delivered. Representative Clark wanted to know if Safford had immediately put it in the process of handling and distribution and disposal, just as in the case of all other magic. Safford said he had. He had checked Kramer's folder of intercepts before Kramer had set out to make his daily routine deliveries of magic intercepts about noon that day, December 4. The winds execute had been included, so presumably it was delivered that day to the usual recipients. Not only that, Safford said, but in addition, it was telephoned around to various people by Admiral Noyes, and so far as I know, that was the first time that had ever been done. About an hour later, Noyes called Safford on the interphone. He did not mention the winds execute specifically, but told Safford that we had better tell Guam to destroy all their excess codes and ciphers. Safford then went to Noyes' office. That was at about 3 p.m. And there, Noyes showed him a several-page message prepared in McCollum's Far Eastern section of Naval Intelligence. The final paragraph of McCollum's long message, Safford testified, closely followed the winds execute, giving every indication that Captain McCollum had read the wind's message, had appreciated its importance, and was trying to get an urgent war warning out to the Pacific Fleet. Safford recalled that according to McCollum's message, Japan was about to declare war on the United States, about to declare war on England, including the Netherlands, East Indies, and so forth, and would maintain peace with Russia. The last sentence added the forecast or evaluation, war is imminent. After the discussion of McCollum's message, Safford saw Wilkinson leave Noyes' office with it in his hand saying, I am going to send this message if I can get the front office to release it. Safford learned much later that the McCollum message had not been sent. Safford responds to winds execute as Chief, Naval Communications Security. Being in charge of the security section of Naval Communications, Safford's jurisdiction and responsibilities were limited to maintaining the security of communications. He was not permitted to send evaluations or orders to men in the field. Any messages he sent had to deal specifically with maintaining document security. In fulfillment of this obligation, and as a result of the receipt of the winds execute, he filed 4 messages for transmittal between 3 and 3:20 p.m. on the afternoon of December 4. He instructed the naval attachés at Tokyo, Peiping, Bangkok, and Shanghai to destroy all secret and confidential files, except those essential for current purposes. Similar instructions were sent to the Commander-in-Chief, Asiatic Fleet in Manila. Safford also sent a priority message to Guam and Samoa at 8 p.m., ordering a change in codes from their then-current code, RIP 65, to a new code, RIP 66. This order was promptly received in Guam. 17 minutes later, a secret message was released by Ingersoll to Guam, deferred precedence to allow time for the new code, RIP 66, to be implemented, asking Guam to destroy all secret and confidential publications, retaining minimum cryptographic channels necessary for essential communications. Be prepared to destroy instantly in event of emergency all classified matter you retain. Then, in the attempt to warn Wake, Safford prepared a strong message that read in part, in view of imminence of war, destroy all registered publications on Wake Island except this system, and current editions of Aircraft Code and Direction Finder Code. Ingersoll refused to send this strongly worded message as drafted by Safford. He released instead an ambiguous message with Wake's name deleted from the text. Moreover, it was held up until December 6 when it was sent deferred precedence, which meant delivery in Pearl Harbor for relay to Wake by 9 p.m. on Monday morning, December 8, 1941. Safford didn't know when it got to Pearl Harbor, but he said no action was taken on it until long after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And then, because we had sent an ambiguous message, the Fleet Communications Officer sent another ambiguous message. The net result was that when Wake was captured, I believe the 24th of December, some of the cryptographic aids fell into Japanese hands, and it was reported at the time by Commandant 14th Naval District. And later, on some of the alphabet strips were captured at Kiska in some of the abandoned Japanese dugouts. Given the limitation of their responsibilities and the Navy's restrictions on their duties, Safford and McCollum did all they could to notify the field commanders. But their intended warnings were watered down, their urgency reduced by being sent deferred priority or withheld. The winds execute seemed to be virtually ignored. Safford could not understand why anyone would want to fail to make use of a winds execute message that meant war. Receipt of winds execute contested by other witnesses. Most of the questions addressed to Safford by members of the JCC concern the winds code and its implementation. Had we or hadn't we intercepted a winds execute before the attack on Pearl Harbor, as Safford maintained? Once the Navy intercepted and translated Japan's winds code setup on November 28th, its code clerks had been alerted to listen to Japanese news broadcasts. Safford insisted their efforts succeeded and that the broadcast in which the crucial false weather message was embedded was intercepted on December 4. Yet few people professed to believe him. They preferred to believe that the Japanese government really hadn't implemented the setup before the attack at all, and that therefore we couldn't have intercepted a winds execute. The situation was complicated by the fact that Safford could find no copy of it in the Navy Department's files. Those files could not be located, he said. All documentary evidence concerning the receipt of a winds execute, together with all information relating to the instructions to watch for it, which had been sent to Cheltenham, Maryland, the station Safford claimed had intercepted it, had vanished. Footnote 66 reads, in the same work, page 3756 through 58. Regulations required the receiving stations, including Cheltenham, to retain one copy of every intercept only until notified that the other two copies forwarded to the Navy Department had been received. Then the receiving stations were free to destroy their copies if they wished, or they could retain them temporarily for reference. Until the August 1945 release to the press of the secret Army and Navy Pearl Harbor reports, the public had heard little or nothing about winds code. Safford gave Hart a list of 15 reliable witnesses he believed had seen the winds execute. In a May 14, 1945 memorandum to Lieutenant Commander John F. Sonnet, Assistant Attorney General in the Navy, who had served as counsel to the Hewitt investigation, Safford listed 26 officers who he believed had known of its interception on December 4, 1941. But when questioned, they denied it. Most of the people who had been in a position before the attack to know of the winds execute, if it had existed, swore they had never seen it. In spite of their testimony, Safford believed that McCollum, Wilkinson, Hewitt, and Noyes, among others, knew it had been intercepted. By the time Safford appeared before the committee, he could not name a single person whom he could confidently expect to corroborate the pre-attack receipt of the message. He would rather not attempt to estimate what any other witness is going to say on the stand. Ferguson then cited 3 or 4 persons involved in the Pearl Harbor investigations other than Safford, who admitted to having seen a winds execute prior to the attack. He quoted specifically from the testimony of Assistant Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ingersoll before the Hart Inquiry and the Naval Court of Inquiry. Footnote 71 reads, in the same work, pages 3788 through 90, Ingersoll testimony before the Hart Inquiry. Concerning others who admitted having seen a winds execute prior to the attack, Ferguson cited an affidavit by a Colonel Moses W. Pettigrew referring to an implementation message which he had seen on or about the 5th of December, 1941. Ferguson also quoted from NCI top-secret testimony by Admiral Turner to the effect that he had learned on December 6 that the winds message came in, and that it meant at least a break in diplomatic relations and probably war. Also, a Lieutenant Colonel Kendall J. Fielder, who had testified before the Roberts Commission, to 3 signal words as an indication that the code had been followed and that the attack was planned. In the same work, Part 8, pages 3792 to 94. Safford said this was the first time that I did not know that I was standing alone against the world in my testimony. Seeking corroboration of his memory, Safford writes Kramer on duty in the Pacific. Safford knew that Kramer was familiar with the winds execute. After all, it was Kramer who had translated the crucial passages and handed the teletyped intercept to Safford on the morning of December 4. Then, a week or so later, Kramer and Safford together had gone over a special folder of messages leading up to Pearl Harbor that Kramer was assembling for acting Navy Secretary Forrestal, in Secretary Knox's absence from the country, in Hawaii, then a territory not yet a state, to investigate the attack. Safford believed a copy of the winds execute was included in that special folder. Safford had discussed the winds intercept with Kramer in the spring of 1943, before Kramer left for Pearl Harbor and active duty in the Pacific. At that time, Kramer's memory, Safford said, coincided with his own. They had not then looked for it, for they had both expected to find everything pertaining to that winds message in the files. In any event, the winds execute was not then in controversy. After that, Safford had had no occasion to talk to anyone about the winds execute until late 1943, when he had been ordered by the Director of Naval Communications to prepare a history of radio intelligence up to and including the attack on Pearl Harbor. He then began researching the pre-Pearl Harbor record, including, of course, the winds code setup and the winds execute. At that point, Safford started asking anyone he encountered who had been on duty in the War and Navy departments prior to Pearl Harbor, and might have been expected to have first-hand knowledge of the winds message, what they could remember about events at that period. That was when Safford learned from Commander Wesley A. Wright, who had it from McCollum, that McCollum's long warning message of December 4 had not been sent. He also discovered then that many intercept files were missing. In his research of pre-Pearl Harbor radio intelligence, Safford testified he wanted the benefit of Kramer's recollections. So on December 22, 1943, he wrote Kramer, then in the Pacific. He asked Kramer primarily about his December 6 through 7, 1941, deliveries of the Japanese 14-part reply to Washington's top officials. The war was still in progress, so Safford phrased his questions very carefully, in the event that my letter might fall into unauthorized hands. He wrote, "We can't find the original weather report and its translation. What became of it?" When Kramer replied, December 28, 1943, he answered the questions about the December 6 through 7 deliveries, but had misunderstood Safford's question about the weather report. Safford wrote a second letter January 22, 1944, asking many more questions about the winds execute. This time he assigned code numbers to persons, dates, messages, places, etc., so that Kramer could answer Safford's questions by citing numbers. He also asked for Kramer's comment on Safford's suspicions since November 15, 1943, which he said had been confirmed December 2, 1943, and absolutely proved January 18, 1944, that Kimmel, long considered a scapegoat, was actually the victim of a frame-up. Safford said he had overwhelming proof of the guilt of OPNAV and the General Staff. Kramer did not reply to Safford's second letter. When Kramer later turned the correspondence over to the JCC, Safford's remarks about a frame-up, OPNAV, and the General Staff returned to haunt him. Why was Safford pressured to change his testimony about the winds execute? Safford knew that when Kramer testified before the NCI in Pearl Harbor during the summer of 1944, he had described in some detail the interception of the winds execute and his role in its translation and disposition. Safford fully expected Kramer to acknowledge that a winds execute had been received before December 7. In fact, Safford said also that Kramer had told him, even after the start of the JCC hearings as recently as just before Christmas, 1945, that he remembered the winds execute. Over and over again, the JCC members asked Safford about the winds code setup and whether a winds execute had actually been received before the attack. Why was no one other than Safford willing to testify to having seen the winds execute before December 7? Safford states, "In 1945, there was a determined effort made to have me reverse my testimony before previous investigations and to say I had never seen the winds message. Relentless effort was made to persuade him that he must be mistaken, that there had never been a winds execute." Lieutenant Commander John Sonnet, Special Representative of the Secretary of the Navy and legal advisor to Admiral Hewitt, interviewed Safford several times. Sonnet had told Safford repeatedly that he thought his memory was playing him tricks, that he might be suffering from hallucinations. Sonnet told Safford he should change his testimony to permit reconciling all previous discrepancies. In some cases, the idea was staged outright. In some cases it was implied, and in other cases it was unexpressed, but obviously the end in view. In all his experience as a commissioned officer of the Navy, Safford said he had never seen anything like it. The whole procedure struck Safford as quite unusual, and he had prepared a memorandum on the subject while the events were still fresh in my memory. Safford believed Sonnet had employed similar tactics on other witnesses whose testimony had favored Admiral Kimmel, particularly Rochefort and Kramer. When Sonnet testified before the JCC later, he denied that he tried to influence Safford in any way. Many witnesses mentioned a false winds message that was at one time believed authentic. Richardson states, "Did it ever occur to you that the false winds message was the only message that ever came in there on the 4th and that you were mistaken?" Safford replies, "This is only about the 20th time such suggestion has been made to me, but I saw the winds message myself." To Safford, it began to look like a conspiracy. A message had been intercepted, he was sure of that, the so-called winds execute, that he considered a short-range forecast of war, positive evidence that the United States would be involved from the very beginning in the war that was looming with Japan. Yet the Washington officials who, according to Safford, had received the message had really done nothing to warn the field commanders about it. McCollum's long warning message had not been sent. What seemed like an orchestrated attempt had been made to persuade anyone who might have seen, or who had ever admitted seeing, the winds execute before the attack to deny it. One person after another named by Safford as possible witnesses, including those who had admitted during earlier investigations that they had seen it before the attack, changed their stories, decided they had been mistaken, or denied that they had seen it at all. Safford himself, who refused to change his story, was vilified. Blame for the surprise attack had been levied by the Roberts Commission and by public opinion against the two Pearl Harbor commanders. And then there was the disappearance not only of the winds execute message itself, which should have been retained in the files, but also any reference to the instructions to Cheltenham Station concerning its interception. Moreover, other crucial pre-attack magic intercepts had turned up missing as well. Representative John W. Murphy questioned Safford about his remarks in his letter to Kramer, to the effect that no one in OPNAV can be trusted, and that Kimmel was victim of a frame-up. Murphy states, "Tell us who was in OPNAV who could not be trusted. Please give us some names. Who were you saying could not be trusted? Names, please. Who could not be trusted? Names, please. I am still waiting. Waiting. Will you please give us the names as to who could not be trusted in OPNAV? Please, sir." Safford replied, "I prefer not to answer." Murphy also asked Safford whom he was accusing of framing Kimmel in short. Framing somebody, Murphy said, was one of the meanest and lowest crimes. When pressed to say whether he felt that the General Staff of the United States Army under General Marshall and the General Staff of the Navy under Admiral Stark had framed Kimmel in short, Safford replied, "I felt that way." Senator Scott W. Lucas also questioned Safford ruthlessly about his letter to Kramer. He asked especially why the men whose names Safford had mentioned, loyal and patriotic Americans all, would want to secrete or destroy or disturb an important message of this kind. Safford finally said that he really had no proper basis for suspicion against Stark and Marshall. He had no suspicion directed against any individual who can be named. But the fact remained. Official records have disappeared from the files of the Navy Department, and that is a suspicious circumstance. I have no idea how they disappeared. It is a fact that they are not present and cannot be accounted for. However, Safford said he had no suspicion against any individual. He could name nobody. Representative J. Bayard Clark was also relentless in questioning Safford. The effect of Safford's winds execute testimony, if true, Clark pointed out, was to accuse the most senior Army and Navy officers, Stark and Marshall, not only of neglect of duty, but also of violating the criminal law of the land by secreting, removing, defacing, or destroying public records. Safford admitted that his testimony was diametrically opposed to that of other witnesses. However, he said, the fact remained that documents were missing from the files. Murphy even badgered Safford about his behavior at the time of the attack. Safford told the committee he had interpreted the winds execute to mean that war would commence within 2 or 3 days in all probability, possibly Saturday, December 6, possibly Sunday, December 7. That was the best estimate that could be made as to the timing implied by a message of that nature. The 1 p.m. message had come in early that Sunday morning, yet Murphy pointed out Safford had had no one on duty to translate that message promptly. He had left the office Saturday at 4:30 p.m. and was at home, in Murphy's words, still in pajamas having breakfast at 2 o'clock. Safford explained that he had fulfilled his responsibilities as head of the security section of naval communications before he left the department on Saturday. He had done his best to alert the men in the field by sending out instructions concerning the need to destroy confidential codes and ciphers. He was not authorized to send out warnings to the field, and he had no responsibility to issue orders to the translators. Neither the Japanese reply to our note of November 26 nor the 1 p.m. message had come in before Safford's duty ended on Saturday. Moreover, Sunday was his regular day off. Even so, Murphy practically accused Safford of not being interested in protecting the American Navy. Murphy states, "Do I understand you to say you are not responsible for anything at all that might help with winning the war?" Keefe interjects, "Mr. Chairman, I don't think that the answer bears any such interpretation. I think it is an unfair question. The witness didn't testify to any such thing. The witness is entitled to some degree of fairness and fair play. I object because the witness has testified that under the setup he had no responsibility for translators. You are trying to make it appear that he did have and had no interest in protecting the welfare of the nation." When Keefe had an opportunity to question Safford, he said he was puzzled and assumed other committee members were too. What possible personal interest, might Safford have in this controversy? "You realize, of course," Keefe said to Safford, "that in view of the implications that have been stated in the cross-examination of you, especially by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Murphy, that you have made some rather strong charges. That may well militate against your career as a naval officer. Did you realize that when you came here as a witness?" "Of course," Safford replied, every time he had testified. True, he had no personal interest, except I started it and I've got to see it through. Keefe states, "And despite the fact that you have nothing personally to gain and everything to lose, you have persisted in the story every time you have testified." Safford replies, "I have. I believe the best defense is telling the truth." Finally, Safford completed 5 days, February 1 through 6, before the JCC, battered and bruised perhaps, but unbound. His testimony remained consistent throughout the investigations. Chief Warrant Officer Ralph T. Briggs, the Cheltenham code clerk who had intercepted the Wind's execute, had bowed to the command of his superior officer and did not testify. Safford had respected Briggs's request for confidentiality, never mentioned his name, and revealed nothing Briggs had told him in confidence. Because of personal problems, his wife was going blind. Briggs complied with the order of Captain Harper, his superior officer, out of fear he would be fired if he disobeyed. Only since his retirement in 1977 has he acknowledged intercepting the Wind's execute and located records proving this. The reassurance Safford received from Briggs that a Wind's execute had actually been picked up on December 4, 1941, must have given him added confidence in standing up to the vigorous and grueling cross-examination by some of JCC's Democratic members. His determination to learn the truth about Pearl Harbor persisted for the rest of his life. He worked closely with this author in trying to follow investigative leads and to explain discrepancies in some of the testimony. Safford later was recognized for some of his contributions to cryptography. On February 11, 1946, the Navy Department awarded him the Legion of Merit for his work as a cryptographic expert from March 1942 to September 1945. In 1958, Congress rewarded him $100,000 for his efforts in solving foreign codes and constructing our own codes. And in 1983, a decade after his death, he was awarded a delayed patent for his invention that overcomes jamming of radio communications. Kramer, U.S. Navy translator and courier, testifies. On February 6, Captain Alwyn Dalton Kramer took the stand. 42 years old and a 1925 graduate of the Annapolis Naval Academy, Kramer had 21 years in the Navy. He had been in charge of a section of the Division of Naval Communications, but at the time of the attack, he had actually been serving under Safford in the security section. During the crucial months before December 7, he had been the Navy's courier and Japanese translator. A couple of years after the attack, he was sent to the Pacific where he served under Admiral Nimitz in Pearl Harbor and then under Admiral Halsey in Noumea, New Caledonia. He had been promoted during the war from lieutenant commander to captain. As Japanese translator and Navy courier, Kramer had been a crucial player in the pre-attack situation. It was hoped that, with his intimate knowledge of the Japanese intercepts, he would be able to shed some light on the receipt of these intercepts and the timing of their delivery to the various recipients. When he was sworn in by Chairman Barkley, the old Senate caucus room was packed, the audience tense in anticipation. Among those who had been attending the hearings regularly for weeks was Alice Roosevelt Longworth, daughter of the late Republican President Theodore Roosevelt and widow of the late Speaker of the House, Nicholas Longworth. Mrs. Longworth was in her usual seat on a bench behind the committee members. At the other end of the room was Mrs. Kramer, who was often seen standing on her seat nervously biting her fingernails. During 5 days, her husband was a witness. Kramer said he had been thoroughly familiar with the Japanese magic intercepts, but it was not essential for the activities of my section that I be so familiar with the negotiations, nor with the status of the diplomatic arrangements and intercourse between this country and Japan. However, his familiarity with the intercepts clearly made him one of the JCC's most important witnesses. Kramer had not been called to testify before the Roberts Commission or the Hart Inquiry. However, in 1943-44, when stationed in the South Pacific, he had had occasion to review the pre-attack situation. At that time, he received 2 letters from Safford, one dated December 22, 1943, which he had answered, and a second dated January 22, 1944, which he had not. Then in mid-May 1944, Kramer's commanding officer, Halsey, received a letter from Kimmel. Kimmel asked Halsey to consult Kramer about the winds execute and the December 6-7 deliveries of the crucial last-minute Japanese intercepts to top Washington officials. Kramer reviewed the situation in his mind at that time and wrote a memorandum. For the benefit of Halsey, answering in effect both Safford's second letter and Kimmel's letter to Halsey, Halsey read Kramer's memorandum and returned it to him. Kramer did not send it to Safford. For reasons of security, he made only a single copy, which he retained in his personal files in a sealed envelope. In September 1944, Kramer was issued travel orders to go from Halsey's headquarters in New Caledonia to Pearl Harbor to testify before the Navy Court of Inquiry. When he appeared on September 13, he spoke quite readily about the arrangements made to intercept weather broadcasts, about his having been shown the winds execute when it was received, and about his having helped to interpret it. The following spring, the Hewitt inquiry had begun. On May 22, 1945, when Kramer appeared there, he was less positive that the winds execute had included the words referring to the United States, Higashi no kaze ame. When recalled by Hewitt a couple of months later, Kramer was again questioned about the winds execute, this time by Lieutenant Commander John F. Sonnet, counsel to Hewitt, and Special Assistant to the Secretary of the Navy. His testimony this time, on July 6, 1945, differed in important respects from his 1944 testimony before the NCI. In replying to Sonnet, Kramer adopted Sonnet's phraseology, agreeing that there was a winds message, but he could not say with certainty what the contents were. Nor could he recall the exact Japanese nomenclature used, but the phrase, not in accordance with expectations, could have the implication of our words, relations are reaching a crisis, either a minor crisis or a major crisis. It could mean simply that negotiations concerning an understanding with the United States were at an end, or that relations were to be broken, or it could even mean that the crisis was so severe that war was imminent. In his testimony before the JCC, Kramer said that in mid or late September, before the committee began its work, he was invited to Stark's home for lunch. Also invited were Schurman and McCollum. The luncheon was largely and primarily a social affair, and we discussed old times. But Kramer said some aspects of Pearl Harbor were discussed. The chief point he remembered was as to what time Admiral Stark got down to his office Sunday morning, December 7, and whether there was a conference in his office. There were no papers at the luncheon, and no mention was made of the winds code message, the pilot message, or the 14-part Japanese reply. Then on September 28, Kramer was hospitalized. A month earlier, he had gone to the Navy Medical Hospital at Bethesda for a routine physical checkup. The hospitalization of the most important witness in the upcoming congressional investigation attracted press attention. A United Press dispatch reported Republican charges denied by the Navy that he had been broken in mind and body and was being held incommunicado in a hospital psychopathic ward. An Associated Press story also held, quoting an unidentified source, that Kramer was being badgered to change his original testimony. According to the New York Times, Kramer had been beset and beleaguered, badgered and beset by an effort to break down his testimony. He denied the charge and asserted that he was feeling very well and would appear before the committee prepared to state fully anything I know that they may want to know. Kramer was visited in the hospital by Safford and committee members Gearhart and Keefe. Their conversation was very pleasant in nature, Kramer said. They made no attempt to bulldoze him into changing his opinion or anything of that kind. Kramer was also interviewed at the hospital by reporters. Kramer's NCI Winds Code testimony versus his refreshed JCC testimony. In his December 1943 and January 1944 letters, Safford had asked Kramer about his recollections of the pre-attack situation in Washington, especially about the winds execute in Kramer's December 6-7 intercept deliveries. When Kramer appeared before the JCC, Keefe questioned him about his 1944 memorandum prepared for Admiral Halsey. In that memorandum, and again before the NCI, Kramer had detailed his role in translating and delivering the pre-attack intercepts. Passage by passage, Keefe went over the memorandum with Kramer, and passage by passage, Kramer modified his 1944 statements. There were serious discrepancies between Kramer's earlier 1944 NCI testimony and his later newly refreshed JCC recollections concerning the receipt or non-receipt of a winds execute. At the NCI, Kramer had testified quite readily about the winds execute, even volunteering details on his own. Higashi no kaze-ame is east wind, rain. The sense of that, however, meant strained relations or a break in relations, possibly even implying war with a nation to the eastward, the United States. However, when Keefe questioned Kramer, he waffled. Keefe states, "Was it the truth?" Kramer replies, "It was not, sir. It was the truth as it came to my mind at the time." That occasion, namely the Naval Court of Inquiry, was the first time that the question of what country appeared in that piece of teletype ever came up in any conversation in which I was participating. Keefe states, "So that we now have a situation where you make a statement on a vital issue before the Naval Court of Inquiry, which you admit was not true because you claim that subsequent events have now convinced you that the answer which you gave was not true. Is that the fact?" Kramer replies, "Despite the fact that I was caught cold at the NCI on that point when the question was propounded, my reaction even then was that only one country was involved on that piece of teletype paper." Keefe states, "Now you want us to understand when I read your testimony before the Naval Court that according to your present, refreshed, and current recollection you were mistaken, that there were no such words in the message that you saw." Kramer replies, "No words referring to the United States." Keefe states, "You do not remember what words were in the message. Is that your testimony, Captain?" Kramer says, "What I mean to imply by that, I think it has been reiterated many times, is that I do not now and have never known since the time I saw that piece of teletype exactly what Japanese phraseology was in it, sir." Keefe states, "You pretended to know what words were in it when you testified before the Naval Court of Inquiry, did you not?" Kramer says, "That was apparently the impression I created, yes, sir." Keefe states, "Yes, now I want to understand what your testimony is today. Am I correct in the assumption that according to your present, or what you have referred to many times as your current recollection after being refreshed, you are not able to tell this committee what words were in that coded execute message?" Kramer replies, "My present belief and conviction is that piece of teletype referred to one country, and that country was England. Nishi no kaze hari." Keefe states, "I asked you the simple question as to whether the statement which you made, which I have read to you, the answers that you gave in response to those questions was the truth. Was it or wasn't it?" Kramer replies, "It was not the whole truth as I see it now, inasmuch as there was no reference in that answer to any handwriting on the teletype message." Keefe then turned Kramer's attention to his mid-1945 testimony before Hewitt concerning the winds execute. Kramer had said at that time, Kramer, "It may have been Higashi no kaze-ame, specifically referring to the United States, as I have previously testified at Pearl Harbor, but I am less positive of that now than I believe I was at the time. The reason for revision in my view on that is the fact that in thinking it over, I have a rather sharp recollection in the latter part of that week of feeling that there was still no overt mention or specific mention of the United States in any of this traffic, which I was seeing all of and which also was the only source in general of my information since I did not see, as a rule, the dispatches from the fleet commanders or going out to them from operations." Keefe replies, "So as late as the time you testified before Admiral Hewitt, you were of the opinion that it may have contained the words Higashi no kaze-ame, but you were becoming uncertain about it in the light of your further refreshing." Kramer replies, "I meant to imply by that I did not recall and still do not recall the precise wording of the Japanese on the piece of teletype paper." Keefe states, "So we now get to the point of your testimony here that there was a message, it had something on it, and must have had something on it to designate it as a winds code execute message. Then I am to understand, Captain Kramer, that this message, which was considered of top importance by everybody, which everybody was looking for and on the lookout for, and for which you have testified specific arrangements had been set up as in connection with no other message, after this message comes in you see it, you read it, you determine that this is the message you've been looking for, and you can't tell us now what was on that message, or what it said." Kramer replies, "That is correct, sir." Keefe states, "Then Mr. Sonnet examined you about a lot of other matters. Then, Captain Kramer, at the conclusion of the examination of Admiral Hewitt, is it a fair assumption to conclude that as far as your testimony discloses, there was a winds execute code message received in the middle of the week, the exact date of which you were then uncertain, which may have referred to the United States, England, or possibly Russia? You were not certain. You were not then certain, and you are not certain what the message specifically said, but it may have referred to one or both or all three of the countries in the original code setup. Is that what you meant to tell Admiral Hewitt? Kramer replies, that is what I meant to tell him at the time. Keefe states, now you, as the man in charge of translations of these messages, with knowledge that the whole government was set to pick up this very vital and important message, who handled that message, who saw it, who read it, who checked the interpretation of the watch officer on that message, sit here before us today and say you can't tell us what the message said. You have no recollection of what it said at all. Is that correct? Kramer replies, that is correct, sir. However, I would like to point out to you, Mr. Keefe, that I think that an entirely unwarranted emphasis and importance is being attributed to that message, not only in this hearing, but in past hearings and in the press. There were many other messages more specific as to Japanese intentions during this period. A wind's message would have been only one further indication of the general trend of this traffic, as well as the general trend of the international situation. Keefe replies, well, I am very happy that you have made that statement, Captain, because I have concluded that, as one member of this committee, a long time ago that there were plenty of messages to have warned those who read them and saw them that war was imminent and just about to break, without this wind's execute message. But Captain Kramer, the Navy Department, and all of the officials in the Navy Department, and I assume the War Department too, considered that the wind's execute message was of supreme importance. Otherwise, why did they set up this great setup of cards and treat it as they did, with complete priority over every other message that was received? Well, it did appear, didn't it? Now, this message came in over the teletype, didn't it? Kramer, yes, sir. Keefe, yes, you saw it. Kramer, I saw it. Keefe states, the thing that attracted the attention of the GY watch officer was that in this message appeared the same Japanese language words that were in the original setup. Isn't that true? And you still want to say to us that you can't recall what those words were? Kramer, that is correct, sir. Keefe, they must have been the words of the original code, otherwise you wouldn't have paid any attention to it. And it is because the words on this teletype were the original Japanese code words in the original code setup that you determined that this was the coded execute message at that time. Isn't that true? Kramer replies, it is not, sir. I should like to explain precisely what I meant by that. The determination was not made by me in the case of this piece of teletype. On the number of previous times when I had been called down concerning possible messages in this wind system, I had examined long sheets of this teletype paper, had looked for the point of whether or not the expression was repeated or appeared as it was supposed to appear in the middle or at the end or both. In this particular case, my presumption was that the GY watch officer had made that determination inasmuch as the piece of paper I saw was only a short piece of paper, 3 or 4 inches in length as I recollect, and that presumably he had identified this message as being an authentic wind's message, not only from the wording that actually appeared in it, but from its location in the Japanese plain language broadcast. That was a function of the GY watch officer, not only as regards this wind system, but as regards all systems to determine its authenticity and to break it down. The only reason for having shown this piece of paper to me was in connection with the Japanese words thereon, and that is all, sir. Keefe states, and you looked at those words and looked at the interpretation which he had given them. You may have corrected it in some particular, and you became convinced that the Japanese language words on that piece of teletype made the message that Japanese code execute message, and so you determined at that time and went down to Captain Safford's office and handed it to him, or saw the watch officer hand it to him and said, here it is, this is it. The thing that we have been straining ourselves for and setting up all this intercepting apparatus. That is true, isn't it? Kramer replies, it is, sir. Keefe states, so if the words Higashe no Kazeyame appear on this wind's execute message, the interpretation would mean east, wind, rain. That is right, isn't it? Then you say that is plain Japanese language. The sense of that, however, meant strained relations or a break in relations, possibly even implying war with a nation on the eastward, the United States. Now that interpretation is the same today as it was when you testified out there before the Naval Court of Inquiry, isn't it? Kramer, exactly, sir. Keefe, so that if you had wanted to, you could have indicated that those words meant war with the United States, couldn't you? And be within the interpretation which you had given to the Naval Court of Inquiry. It was one of the 3 alternatives, was it not? Kramer replies, only Mr. Keefe, insofar as you would evaluate the Japanese instructions contained in the setup of this wind's message, referring to the destruction of codes and classified papers. An evaluation which concluded that that meant war would then include that interpretation. Yes, sir. Keefe then asked Kramer about the cards distributed at the direction of noise to persons who were to watch for a plain-language Japanese winds execute. Kramer had testified before the NCI that these cards had on them the Japanese expressions contained in this exhibit and the meaning. However, Kramer told the JCC that apparently my memory was faulty at that moment as to what was on the cards. My present belief and conviction is that the Japanese expressions did not appear on those cards. Keefe thought it perfectly in line with common sense for Kramer to have listed the Japanese words on the card together with their meaning, so that these top-flight people to whom the cards were directed would be able to compare it, a winds execute, with the Japanese words on the card and then know the meaning. However, Kramer wanted to change that testimony. He insisted that, according to his present, current, refreshed recollection, the only words he had put on the cards were the English translation and the country referred to, and that was all. East wind rain, United States. West wind clear, England. North wind cloudy, Russia. As Keefe's questioning wound down, Kramer admitted that there had been a winds execute. On that point, he and Safford were in agreement, and he had believed that it was an authentic message of that wind system, until the last few days when I had been making further studies, including the reading of interrogations of high Japanese officials by General MacArthur. When Republican Representative Keefe finished questioning Kramer, Democratic Senator Lucas took over. He pointed out that Kramer had had only a few brief seconds of contact, not over 30 seconds, probably nearer 10 or 15 seconds with the winds execute before it was handed to Safford. He had not been involved in its decoding, translation, and delivery. It was by mere chance that he had happened to be in his office as the GY watch officer passed on his way to deliver it to Safford. Thus, Lucas implied, Kramer's contact with the message was so brief that it was not surprising his recollections were not too clear. Pilot message received, announcing Japan's response to U.S. November 26 ultimatum. On Saturday morning, December 6, 1941, U.S. intelligence picked up a Japanese dispatch that became known as the pilot message because it announced to the Japanese ambassadors in Washington the impending arrival of their government's 14-part response to the U.S. note of November 26, rejecting their latest proposal for compromise. This pilot message told the Japanese ambassadors that the time for its presentation to the United States would be wired separately in purple coded English. It would need decrypting but not translating. The timesheet shows that the pilot message was intercepted by a Navy station on the West Coast, December 6, 1941, between 7:15 to 7:20 a.m. East Coast time, and then teletyped in Japanese code to the Navy in Washington. It was more than 4 hours later, 12:05 p.m., when the Army, whose day it was to decode, received it from the Navy. This abnormal delay was never accounted for. It was then decoded, typed up by the Army's Signal Intelligence Service, and delivered to the Army and Navy officer couriers. When Kramer appeared before the JCC on February 6, he acknowledged that the Navy had intercepted the pilot message between 7:15 and 7:20 a.m. that Saturday morning, and that it hadn't reached the Army until 12:05 p.m. In any event, Kramer was as certain as he could be that the first knowledge I had that the 14-part Japanese note was being sent to the United States was around 3 or shortly after 3 p.m. Saturday, December 6, 1941. Although the Army might possibly have delivered the pilot message to Kramer's section earlier in the afternoon, he had no recollection of seeing that message until later in the afternoon. 2 days later, Kramer changed the story he was telling the JCC. He said he didn't believe the pilot message had been disseminated Saturday afternoon at all and listed it, Navy number 7149, as one of several intercepts that were delivered at 10:30 Sunday morning. I find as a result of my study last night, after referring to a Navy Department file, that the pilot message was not disseminated, at least in the Navy, until Sunday morning subsequent to 10 o'clock, at the time when the so-called hidden word message and a number of other short messages, including the 1 o'clock messages, were disseminated. When Senator Ferguson asked Kramer, "If you did not know what this pilot message was until 10:30 on Sunday morning, how did you know there was going to be a 14th part? How did you know without the pilot message that you were going to get an answer to the 26th note?" Kramer replied that he did not, at least know positively, but certainly at the time, and now presumed from the context of the parts we were breaking down, that that must be the reply to Mr. Hull's note of 26 November. Ferguson tried to find out what there was in the records to show whether the pilot's message had actually been received in the Navy Department Saturday, December 6, or Sunday morning, December 7. Kramer admitted that there is nothing whatsoever in the file, Senator, to show definitely one way or another that point. Kramer repeated again the next day his account of the Sunday morning receipt and delivery of the pilot message. His present belief, he told the JCC, was that he did not get it in my section from the Army until the next morning, Sunday, December 7, sometime between 9 and 10:30 that morning. His memory had been refreshed since I got to studying this on my arrival at Washington. As a matter of fact, Kramer told the JCC 2 days later that he did not believe the pilot message had even been included with the first delivery early on the morning of the 7th, but that it had become available only in time for the second round of deliveries. According to the study I made a few days ago, my best knowledge and present conviction is that my section in the Navy Department did not receive it until approximately 10:25 or 10:30 Sunday morning. His sole reason for saying this, he told Ferguson, was due to the fact that in the Navy book, the pilot message, appears after the 14-part message and after the 1 o'clock message. Thus, he had been led to the conclusion that it must have been delivered Sunday instead of Saturday. Kramer testifies further on Japan's reply to U.S. November 26 note and other matters. When Republican Senator Brewster took over the questioning of Kramer, he said he was amazed that Kramer had not reread the memorandum he had written at Halsey's request in 1944, not even when he had shown it to others, Lieutenant Commander Beecher, Admiral Wilkinson, his longtime personal friend, Captain Rochefort, and Marine Corps Colonel Bales. Brewster could see no reason why Kramer shouldn't have reviewed his memorandum prior to his appearance before the JCC. It would have been far easier to credit his story if he had, rather than basing his entire present recollection on the refreshment received from consultation with officers who examined that document. Kramer, like Safford, had been examined by Sonnet, counsel in the Hewitt inquiry. Senator Lucas asked Kramer if his experience with Sonnet had been at all similar to Safford's. Kramer denied that Sonnet had badgered or beset him at any time or tried to persuade him to change his testimony. He knew of no one in the Navy, Army, State Department, or Chief Executive's office who had provoked, angered, or tricked those peace-loving and harmless Japs into attacking Pearl Harbor, or who had maneuvered, conspired, or attempted to lay the sole blame for the Pearl Harbor disaster on Kimmel and Short. Kramer was also asked why there were occasional gaps in the numbered intercepts. Sometimes the numbering machine would skip a number, he said. Army and Navy both often worked on decryption of the same intercept, he said, and both would assign it a number. When it was discovered later that the same message had been given 2 different numbers, one was canceled. When asked to explain the missing WINS execute teletype, Kramer said he believed the purpose of having duplicates for any of this traffic, whether encoded or plain language, was to have an extra copy for systems which we were not reading, so that more than one person could work on that system in attempting to break it down. As for the WINS execute, Kramer had not had anything specifically to do with it. It had gone directly to Noy's office and had not been handled through Kramer's office. Representative Cooper, vice chairman of the committee, questioned Kramer about how all the documents relating to the WINS execute could have vanished from the files. He could offer no explanation. Given the precautions that had been taken to conceal the combination to the safe in which these papers were kept, Kramer couldn't understand it. Only he and 2 others knew the combination, and if anyone had broken into the double-sealed envelope in the Navy Department's front offices where the combination was kept, someone would surely have known. Vice Chairman states, I understand then, Captain, that these messages, including the number 7001, were in your custody and were kept in your safe in your office. Kramer replies, yes, sir. Vice Chairman, and all of the files were in their proper order and in their proper place and kept there in your safe. Kramer replies, that is correct, sir. I might further amplify that answer, sir, to this effect, that the so-called numerical file, after a series of messages were numbered for dissemination, a copy was invariably and immediately inserted in that numerical file. Messages were never removed from that numerical file for reference or for any other purpose. That numerical file had 2 primary purposes, 1 to have a solid file of what had been translated and disseminated, and 2, the primary purpose was to have something to which the translators could turn in case of references to back traffic, when future messages were received. We had a very complete and involved cross-index system on 3x5 cards, covering every originator in the Japanese diplomatic service. By that I mean every consulate, every embassy, every legation that originated messages had their own serial numbers for their series of messages. From this basic numerical file, there was no occasion that I know of where anything was removed or destroyed from that file, with the exception of the fact that if it was determined later, probably a few days or a week later, that we had 2 identical messages, one of which was a duplication of another, when that was discovered, the latest numerical file number would be canceled as a duplication of the earlier one. Vice Chairman states, well, could anybody have gone in there and filched or stolen all of the messages relating to the WINS execute message, and you have known nothing about it? Kramer replies, I don't see how that would be possible, sir, with this possible exception. that the combination of the safe in which these were kept, there was a copy of that combination in a double-sealed envelope in some of the front offices. If that envelope had been opened, someone else would, of course, be able to open my safe. Otherwise, the only people who knew the combination of the safe in which that particular file was kept were three people: Lieutenant Harrison, the then Chief Yeoman Bryant, and myself. From an examination of the files last Saturday in the Navy Department and this study, Exhibit 142 of about a week or so ago, I am as positive as I can be that file number 7001 could not possibly have been any WINS message. That is in addition to the fact that I have absolutely no matter of any kind, no recollection, no knowledge that a WINS message was ever written up by my section. Keefe questioned Kramer about the Japanese government's 14-part reply. According to Kramer's 1944 memorandum, Kramer recalled receiving the first 13 parts during the afternoon of December 6. He had tried by phone to locate Beardall, Turner, Wilkinson, and Bratton. He had tried unsuccessfully to reach Stark. Kramer said he had delivered the 13 parts to Beardall's aide at the White House that Saturday evening. He also told the JCC that he delivered the 13 parts about 9:45 p.m. to Knox at the Wardman Park and had then gone to Wilkinson's home in Arlington, Virginia, where he was having a dinner party. Kramer delivered to Wilkinson's home, and Beardall was there. Kramer thought Wilkinson may have phoned Stark and Turner that evening. Admiral Wilkinson was present, also Captain Beardall, FDR's naval aide. Kramer said his memory had been refreshed only quite recently to the effect that General Miles was also present. Kramer had then returned to the Navy Department before going home. He was positive that he had not delivered the 13 parts of the Japanese reply that evening either to Ingersoll, the Assistant Chief of Naval Operations, or Turner, Chief of the Navy Warplanes Division. Yet apparently Turner had seen it that evening. He testified before the NCI that a rather long dispatch had been brought to him, sometime during the very late evening of December 6 or the early morning of December 7. The officer who brought the dispatch to the House stated that there was a part of the message missing, the latter part. Still, Kramer maintained he had neither telephoned Ingersoll nor delivered to him directly any of these intercepts that night. Kramer held also that he had not delivered the 13 parts to Turner, although he had testified to the contrary. Ferguson read an excerpt from Turner's JCC testimony, and Kramer had to agree that Admiral Turner knew what he was talking about. However, Kramer continued to maintain that he had made no delivery to Turner that evening. He would admit only that Turner's recollection obviously differs from my recollections. Ferguson elicited from Kramer that he had drafted for Noyes a December 1 message concerning Japanese movements in Thailand, thousands of miles from any U.S. possessions. Ferguson wanted to know why, especially if Kramer knew nothing about our policy in case of an attack by the Japanese on the British. He felt that we should ensure that they, SINCAF and SINCPAC, got that picture, sir, even though they may have received it and read it on the Asiatic station. The British also at Singapore, and the unit at Honolulu. Why would he, Kramer, send a message that involved the British and the Japanese 1,000 miles from any of our possessions directly to the information of SINCPAC, which was Admiral Kimmel, when he had not sent to either the Pacific or Asiatic Fleet the ship movement message, which set up a plan of Pearl Harbor, indicating what they wanted it for was an attack later? Kramer said that every message bearing on ship movements, either of our Navy, our merchant marine, or foreign navies, specifically England, was given high priority in my section, and all were translated and disseminated by my section. He admitted that the Japanese had used this grid bombing map for all ship movements subsequently to setting up of this abbreviated system of reporting ships in Pearl Harbor. However, evaluation was never at any time a function of his section. Moreover, Kramer pointed out, Pearl Harbor was not the only base the Japanese had been watching. Back in 1940, during the course of negotiations with the Dutch in Java, the Japanese conducted rather rigorous reconnaissance of all military establishments, not only in Java but in other islands of the Dutch East Indies. They had also requested information on the military establishments, air bases, fleet facilities in Panama, and in part of the Western Hemisphere under United States jurisdiction. The Japanese diplomatic service, as well as their military and naval attachés abroad, Kramer testified, were very conscientious people and reported in meticulous detail all facts that they could learn. They likewise reported in great detail the air bases in the vicinity of Seattle and Bremerton Navy Yard, sir, similarly on the San Francisco area. Nevertheless, Kramer could not point to any request from the Japanese in the latter part of November or December 1941 in relation to San Francisco and Seattle for bombing maps of any locations other than Pearl Harbor. Kimmel was on the witness stand for 5 long days, February 6 through 11, 1946. February 10 was a Sunday. After he finished testifying, he returned to the hospital where he remained until after the committee's reports were released for the Sunday papers of July 21. The next month, at age 46, he was given a medical discharge and an untaxed pension. He maintained his silence on Pearl Harbor throughout his remaining 26 years. He died in 1972. Bratton, Army Courier, on delivery of Japan's reply to U.S. note of November. Colonel Rufus Bratton was another key figure in the events of December 6 through 7. As Army Courier, he had been Kramer's counterpart, charged with the delivery of the Japanese magic intercepts to the Army's list of officials entitled to see them. These included Hull, Stimson, Marshall, Garrow, and Miles. Bratton's chief assistant had been Colonel Carlisle C. Dusenberry. Every time Bratton testified, he changed his story slightly in some respects. On September 15, 1944, he had told Colonel Clark, who was conducting a special investigation for Marshall, that Japan's 14-part reply started coming in on the 6th of December. It was then his recollection that he had transmitted a copy to the Secretary of State that night. He made no mention of any other deliveries that evening. On September 30, 1944, when appearing before the Army Pearl Harbor Board, Bratton testified that he had had the bulk of it, the Japanese reply, since the evening of December 6. It came in 14 parts. 13 of those parts were received the afternoon and evening of the 6th. He said he had delivered the first 13 parts to 3 recipients that evening: the Office of the Chief of Staff, actually Marshall's Secretary, Colonel, later General Bedell Smith; the AC of SG2, actually Garrow's Executive Officer, Colonel Gailey; the Office of the Secretary of State. On July 27, 1945, in an affidavit for Clausen, who was touring the Army's several theaters of operations under orders of Stimson to interview and collect sworn affidavits from persons involved in some way with Pearl Harbor, Bratton had given a still different account of the events of December 6 through 7. Clausen had shown Bratton several sworn affidavits submitted by men Bratton knew, some of them Bratton's superiors in the Army. Bratton had interpreted some of those affidavits as differing from his previous testimony, although on examination it is apparent that they were not actual contradictions so much as merely carefully crafted evasions. However, they influenced Bratton to revise his statement. In his affidavit for Clausen, Bratton had said that after receiving the first 13 parts of the Japanese reply and ascertaining that the 14th part would not be coming in that evening, he had directed Dusenberry to deliver the set for the Chief of Staff at his home at Fort Myer. The affidavit stated further, in contradiction to his APHB testimony, that he had delivered only one set of those 13 parts that evening himself, the set destined for the Secretary of State, which he had left between 10 and 11 p.m., with the night duty officer at the State Department. He also said in his affidavit that the sets for the other officials on Bratton's list were delivered the next morning, 7 December 1941, with the 14th part. Bratton had said that when he saw Marshall that morning, Marshall had on his desk the 14-part message, which he had not given him. He could not explain how it had reached Marshall. According to Bratton, any prior statements or testimony of mine which may be contrary to my statements here, the affidavit for Clausen, should be modified and considered changed in accordance with my statements herein. This affidavit now represents my best recollection after having my memory refreshed in several ways and respects. By the time Bratton was finally called to the witness stand by the Joint Congressional Committee, he had been listening for months to the sworn testimony of witnesses, some of whom had contradicted one another, some had even contradicted their own earlier testimony, and some had offered to shoulder the blame for Marshall's possible delinquencies. As the bewildered Bratton took the chair on February 14, 1946, suspense pervaded the packed hearing room. Delivery to top officials evening of December 6 of Japanese reply to U.S. ultimatum. Respecting the receipt of the pilot message, Bratton contradicted the testimony of his Navy opposite, Kramer. Kramer's refreshed testimony was that the message had not reached him, ready for delivery, until about 10 or 10:30 Sunday morning, December 7. However, it was undoubtedly available to Navy officials in Washington on Saturday afternoon, for several Navy officers testified that it had been phoned or distributed to the usual Navy recipients by then. Bratton told the JCC the message had first come to his attention at about 2 p.m. on Saturday, that it had been translated by the Army, typed, and delivered to him. He then had it distributed that afternoon about 3 o'clock to the full list of persons for whom he was responsible. Bratton said he even recalled discussing its contents with both Garrow and Miles. If the pilot message had been decoded and distributed on Saturday, as Bratton testified, then Washington officials would have been on notice that Tokyo's reply to our November 26 note was on its way. They expected this reply to be a rejection of our proposal, so they would have had reason to anticipate a final break with Japan, possibly the outbreak of war, and would have had some opportunity to think about how best to respond. If it had not been available until Sunday morning, as Kramer said, the top personnel would not have been expecting Japan's response and would have had little time to anticipate and decide how to respond to the Japanese threat. When the first 13 parts of Japan's reply, which had been intercepted, decoded, and typed up by early Saturday evening, were actually placed in the hands of the top Washington officials, was crucial for determining what we knew of Japan's intentions prior to the attack. Bratton had testified variously about his deliveries of this intercept. JCC Associate General Counsel Kaufman asked him about these several discrepancies. Now, before answering your